Good evening, dear friends of Open Lithuania Foundation. It is great pleasure to welcome all of you today because we start second cycle of Rethinking Europe discussions with our dear guest from Sofia, Professor Ivan Krastev. I know that I don't have to introduce Professor with all these academic titles and all names of his books, but let me say only a few words. Professor Ivan Krastev is a political scientist. He's a chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Science, Vienna. His latest book in English, After Europe, which was published in 2017, and I strongly believe that such book will be really important for our discussion.
Good evening, my name is Donatas, and I'm very glad to see so many people here today inside the House of Open Lithuania Foundation. This discussion is organized in company with European Humanities University, so thank you also. And as we, together with Aurimas, were preparing for today's discussion, we thought about two main topics to focus on. So the first one is the idea of united Europe and its future, and the second one is interconnected, but it's the future of the liberal democracy. And also, what can be done? It's not just, you know, I guess, and I hope that we gathered today here not only to discuss what's wrong, but also what to do and what we can do, all of us. And of course, we are ready for unexpected questions. We will give floor to you to ask, to discuss, and
if I may add, please join our discussion as soon as possible, because it is not a matter of three guys between.
Yeah. And so I would like to start with the question that it's in my head for a very long time, and it's related with two recent books that I've read about Europe. The first one is, of course, yours, dear Ivan. It's After Europe. The second one is the book written by Douglas Murray, The Strange Death of Europe. And the question which comes into my head, what do we see today? Because at least what I had understood is that from your book that maybe we see the disintegration or the problems that are faced by Europe as a political project, whereas Douglas Murray argues about that we see the death of Europe as a civilization, not only as a political project. And I'm very interested in your comments, maybe also about Douglas's book, but also how do you see the contemporary situation of Europe?
First, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for being here. There is one, I never knew before why people are so quick to write next book. And now I know, because you basically try to limit the discussions on your previous book. Because you have basically the feeling that all the time we're in the same question. Listen, in the book there was three very simple arguments, and don't forget it was written in 2017, basically it was finished 2016. And the major argument was, for many people, particularly in Western Europe, European Union was taken for granted. And I was not buying it. I do believe, like every political construction, European integration was a success. It can also be reversed. The idea that it is irreversible for me was never something that I was taking seriously. And from this point of view, my first point was there is one major difference between East Europeans and West Europeans when they're looking at the crisis in the European Union. All East Europeans, nevertheless, where politically they have been standing over the years, have been witnessing and have the collapse of the Soviet system as their personal experience. And we know how quickly certain dynamics can develop. Listen, in the mid-1980s, communism in Bulgaria was solid like nature. It was not Poland. You can imagine, even you know where you'll go after you're going to retire. And then over a period of weeks, the world is very much changing, and it was a political, it was psychological. You cannot say that basically these 3 or 4 weeks economically, structurally changes. So in my view, the problem of disintegration happens in the heads of the people. And this was the first argument. The second argument, and this is something which I do believe for you is not going to be a major surprise, but it was a kind of a strange news for many of the Western readers of the book, was the following. I believe that migration crisis is the most important of the different crises that the European Union is facing, but for different reasons in the East and on the West. Seen from the West, everybody was saying, where is the problem with Eastern Europe? Migration so much polarized the political space, but they don't have any refugees, which is true. And my argument was, go deeper than this. This is not about migration, it's about emigration. What has happened to Central and Eastern Europe in the last 30 years is a major depopulation. If you go, and I do believe the Baltic countries are one of them, Bulgarian figures looks like this. Since 1989, Bulgaria has lost 21% of its population. In the next 25 years, if the UN projections are right, we are going to lose 27% more. So in my view, migration simply activated certain demographic panic, which was the result of combination of aging population and young people living, which created the idea that probably in 50 years or 100 years, your ethnic group is not going to be around at all. Nobody is going to read Bulgarian poetry anymore. And this is a metaphysical fear. And this is, because it is a metaphysical fear, you cannot argue against this with economic arguments. We all know a very serious economic arguments why migration is important, but people are answering totally different question. And here is the paradox for East Europeans in this crisis. Opening of the borders was the best that has happened to us. And it also turns to be the worst. Even now, when you basically ask people what is the best that happened after 1989, they're going to say opening of the borders. And then this same phenomena is what's threatening you. And this is quite important because otherwise people are not going to understand exactly the fact why you have so much nervousness in countries which are not doing economically bad, because unlike southern countries which have a major economic problems, listen why Greece is so politically unstable, you don't need much imagination to ask about. You're just seeing what is happening to the Greek economy. Greek economy lost 1/3 of its GDP. This is like Russia in the 1990s. So people are losing job, unemployment, but why Poland? Poland has for 27 years economic growth every 3 months. This is one of the longest in the European history. Even more, people are going to say social inequality. In the case of Poland, for the last 5 years, even the Gini coefficient has changed positively. So from this point of view, there was a famous Adam Przeworski, the famous political scientist, when he was asking why basically was this radical political turn in Poland, he answered like this. He said, theoretically, this should not have happened. So I'm saying this because also there were 3 other arguments which I want to make before going, because just to know where I'm coming because going to the civilization. The other thing that has changed is the following. In 1900 or 1913, before the World War I, there were 2 Europes. There was Western Europe and there was Central Europe. And where there was the difference between the two, one was quite ethnically homogeneous, and this was the Western Europe. And the other was very much culturally diverse, and this was Central Europe. In 1938, 66% of the population of Poland were Poles. Others were Germans, Ukrainians, Jews. Now, more than 97% of the population of Poland are Polish. This is true for all Central European countries. We didn't do it ourselves. The ethnic cleansing came from outside. But the story is that now you have 2 Europes again. One is ethnically homogeneous, and this is Central Europe. The other is becoming much more ethnically diverse, and this is Western Europe. Just to give you the figures. Compare Hungary and Austria next to each other. 4% of the population, of the citizens of Hungary today were not born in Hungary. But all of them are Hungarians being born in Transylvania or basically in Serbia. 16% of the citizens of Austria today are not born in Austria. This is the higher percent than in the United States. 50% of the students in the Vienna schools do not have German as a first language. So why I'm saying this? Because one of the interesting, and in my view still not understand nature, of the very strong nationalistic wave coming from Central and Eastern Europe is that this nationalism is not so much, and this nationalistic rhetoric meant to build a wall on the borders between Serbia and Hungary, so for example, foreigners not to come. It's about building a rhetorical wall between Hungary and Austria, so people are not going to go. Hungary has lost more population in the last 8 years than after 1956. Young people are leaving for good, not for political reasons. By the way, not that they're running from Orban. This is not true. But simply they want a different life. They want to change something. They see different opportunities. Moving today is not it was before. Before this was a one-way ticket. Now it is not. But as a result of it, for everybody, and we know it very well with Professor Ignatov in Bulgaria, when you're living in a place where people are exiting, three important things are happening. First, even if you are personally successful in a society which is basically depopulated, you have the idea of a collective failure, rightly or wrongly. Most of the people who are living outside of our countries has a worse life than the one they would have here, particularly in the Baltics, but it's true even for Bulgaria and Romania. But the very fact that all your friends, or some of them, are leaving makes your staying problematic. Secondly, and this is very important, governments discovered two things. And they discovered that you don't need repression anymore, because those who don't like the situation most, they will not vote, they will leave. So paradoxically, you never had a critical mass of people for change. And this is particularly true in Central and Eastern Europe, where the young population is a very small demographic cohort. If you talk in electoral terms, the young voters don't matter. They're not deciding elections. And as a result of it, this explains why you have so much youth protests on the street. Youth can be seen only when they're on the streets. They cannot be seen in the ballot boxes. And the third thing that happened, and I do believe this is very important, you have historians here, about the historical imagination. When, for example, you have the idea of the end of civilization and so on, what we know how civilizations die? We know the story of the Roman Empire, and this is the barbarians coming. And this is it. And this is it true or not? There are people who know more about this period than me. But this is the way, basically, our collective imagination works. And this triggers certain type of reactions that you cannot explain on the level of interest or values and so on. But this basically have these narratives going very strongly and basically shaping how people behaved. There was this beautiful book called The Idea of Europe by George Steiner, famous American literary critic, but he was an Austro-Hungarian Jew, being born in Paris. He lived most of the time in. And he said that for him, 5 things are distinctive for Europe. So this is. He said, what is Europe? Europe is a place of pedestrians, people who walk. He said, Europe is this cultural space where basically you're seeing it through walking people. Nobody comes with the idea that you're going to walk the United States. But the European cities are very much there. Secondly, he said, this is the place of the coffee shops, where people go, discuss ideas, conspire, creates radical parties, doing this and that, but everything happens in this very special publicity that coffee shops creates, where the newspapers are there and there for free. Thirdly, he said, Europe is a place where streets and squares has names of statements and poets and writers. So you're not going to go in Vilnius on the 42nd Street. In a certain way, history is part of it. Fourthly, he said, Europe is a place that comes brought from Athens and Jerusalem as a kind of a tradition. But fifthly, and this is why I'm saying, he said, Europe is also a civilization that was always very much aware of its ending. In a certain way, thinking about that probably we are going to end one day, according to him, is a very specific for the European type civilization, and this is connected to the World War I. In a certain way, we witnessed kind of European civilization being destroyed. China is not like this. Not that I'm a great expert on China, but what you're reading on China, for example, Chinese don't use the word rice when we now talk about the rise of China. They said about return. They do believe that the period in which the West was up was a small period of time, and simply things are going back to their natural form. Why I'm saying this? This idea of end, of death of civilization, is a very important part of the European discourse born out of the World War I. All the Spenglers and so on and so on. So from this point of view, I do believe that this is why you should not take it so dramatically, the idea of the death of European civilization, because European civilization is one that is obsessed with talking about its death. So probably it's not as bad as it looks.
Professor, you just mentioned Steiner's book and briefly presented the 5 most important things which unite European culture or civilization. Yeah. But why it is so difficult to talk about common ideas, values, and historical narrative in 21st century, right now, despite that we have all that intellectual, historical, and cultural heritage from, I don't know, from antique, medieval ages, Renaissance, Enlightenment epochs. But it is the most important question and most difficult question.
I agree, and probably I'm going to say something trivial, but in biology, it's very well known that you have, if basically your eyes are going to be kind of divided, and with one eye you see something moving, and in the other something not moving, you remember only thing that is moving. Part of the problem of the world understanding itself in the 21st century is that we see only things that are changing. We basically have the feeling that people are totally mobile, that people move all the time, and so on. Do you know that in France, 40% of the population lives, works, and dies less than 40 kilometers from the place where they have been born? So from this point of view, there is one world that is changing very much, but this is not changing with the same speed for everybody. We always had the feeling that the way, and to be honest, most of the people being part of these discussions and being interested in these questions are people who have a life which is, most of these university people. How many of the people here do not have university education? Not a single one. And as a result of it, basically we assume that most of the people basically are like this, but it's not. And one of the things that has happened is, paradoxically also because of social media and other things, you have a much more fragmented world than ever before. The decline of the nation states made it very strongly, because we are lacking some of the most important common experiences. To be honest, one of them being war. It's good that we are lacking it, but nothing integrates society more than war. Nobody can explain the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, not taking into account that it was during the World War II, when the blacks and whites have been dying together under the American flag, that you have the feeling of being included in the nation. The school is also very different, because basically, and this is quite interesting, we normally believe that the schools is one of the major instruments for social mobility and integrating, but you have more and more different types of school, private schools. From this point of view, of course, the United States is a classical example of this. The difference between the best American universities and kind of an average American college is kind of bigger than the difference between New York and Sofia. And from this point of view, we still continue to insist that we're living in the same world, but we're not doing this. Also, when you see even in economic terms, the level of social inequality is quite staggering. So what is happening is that for a certain period of time, because of the very big speed of changes, we have been seeing also this part of society that have been changing with all these kind of contradictions and others. And then suddenly, you have basically a very strong message coming from those who said, stop it. We cannot tolerate this change anymore. We are destabilized. We don't know who we are. We're losing our identity. We want basically the world to stop. And from this point of view, the interesting story about most of the populist discourse today is that it's not about future. You're promising people to go back to a certain past. Different parties have a different idea which was the best time that we have lost. But in a certain way, the future is not something to be discussed anymore. I'm going to end on something. I was interested what people read. I was always very much interested in this. And here is an interesting observation based on something that I was trying to study. In order to understand how difficult it's going to be for the United States to get a common vision for the future, you try to compare what people are reading in the Silicon Valley and what they're reading in Washington. You have the political elites and you have the technological elites being critically important. Politicians read history and political biographies. So the major question is, in which period we are back? Are we in the 1930s? Are we at the 19th century? Silicon Valley people believe only old science fiction, when the science fiction was positive, not dystopian. So it's the end of the 20th century type of a science fiction. So for them, the idea is where to start from the beginning. I was very much surprised to see that in a certain way, this is why disruption is so important for these people, because they don't believe that things should be improved. If you see what these people are collecting, they're going to buy an island, or you want to go on a new planet. You want to start from the beginning. You want to have a totally different project. So now imagine that you're going to have a political project that should be renegotiated between the Silicon Valley and the Washington. And I'm using this as a metaphor for two of the most part of the elites. And there is one more argument that I want to make, and this is in the book, and this is not the part of the book that many people like, but the story is the following. If you see the anti-Brussels sentiment, and to be honest, I don't have many sympathy. I never understand how Brussels works. I'm doing quite a lot of Russia. To be honest, I better understand how Moscow works than how Brussels works. Probably wrongly, but yeah. And the story is, don't forget, Jaspers used to say, fatherland is a place where you understand and you believe that you understood. From this point of view, EU has a problem because really very few people understand how it works and very few feel that they understood. But here's the story. Why in a world that is becoming so complex, so much based on knowledge, why people who are ready to give all their money to send their kids to the best universities, why these people do not want to be governed by people who graduate from these universities? Because if you see this new populist wave, it's not simply against the elites. It is against the elites that make their power or money based on education. It is about certain idea of meritocratic elites. For example, I have been particularly studying some of the surveys of the Tea Party movement. Tea Party movement are not against social inequality. They have nothing against rich people or very rich people. But they are strongly against very rich people who have graduated Harvard or Stanford. The problem is why? Where is the problem? Is this not the... And most of these people, for example, if you see the high bureaucracy in Brussels, people coming from humble backgrounds, most of them made their career just giving exams, for Bulgarian criteria at least, not a corrupt elite. Probably Swedes or Norwegians can find them corrupt. For Bulgarians, they're very clean. So why? Where is the problem? And here's my argument. Meritocratic elites has three characteristics that are really problematic for people. First, they're very arrogant. Because you have the feeling that you made your career the right way, you don't believe that you owe anything to anybody. For the meritocratic elites, basically, society is like school. We all go on exams. Some are doing well on exams, others not. And those who are not doing well, they should not complain. And then the populists come and say, no, 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 it's not like school. It's like family. I'm going to help you, not because you deserve, but because we are one and the same. Secondly, meritocratic elites are very mobile. If you're a good professor, you can teach here, but you can teach in Brussels, you can teach in London, you can teach in Tokyo. So in the time of a crisis, you have an exit option. Most of the people do not have an exit option. 10 years ago in Bulgaria, if you speak a foreign language, this is going to increase your chance to be elected in the parliament. Today, I don't know if Professor Ignatov is going to agree, if you do not speak a foreign language, this is increasing your chance to be elected. And the logic, and the logic of the people is not so absurd as it looks. The logic is, listen, this one does not speak foreign language, he has nowhere to go. So in a certain way, I can rely much more on him. So the problem with the meritocratic elites is like the problem with the highly paid professional footballers. You're buying them, and while they're winning, everybody is admiring them and praising them, but if the team starts losing, they cannot expect pity, because they're foreign to the town. They don't have relatives, they don't have friends, they're not rooted in this place, and the only thing that gives them legitimacy is victory. So from this point of view, in the time of crisis, nevertheless, that meritocratic elites, in general, are much more competent and, in my view, better prepared for these complex times in which we're living. They end up as more illegitimate. So while everybody talks about the crisis of European Union as the crisis of democracy, and of course there is a lot of this and it was discussed, I do believe we see also particular crisis of trust in meritocratic elites. And this is globally, but in the European Union it is even more important, because basically the legitimacy, this idea of the output legitimacy about which political scientists like to talk, is very much based on this.
You speak about the ideas and that they are not just something, they matter in the public sphere. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was the idea of the end of history. Now we know that it didn't succeed, the history didn't finish. And then the question can be, if Fukuyama was wrong, maybe Huntington was right, that we live in the world of clash of civilizations. But then I even think further, not about Huntington, but for example about Carl Schmitt and his description of political as the distinction between friend and enemy. And for example, in your book, you also quote the historian Tony Judd, who writes that more and more people, they know their identity in negative terms, that they are not, for example, Orthodox, not Jewish, not European, not something. And then I wonder, is there any way out of today's, of this Schmittian world of friend and enemy, especially concerning in mind what you write in your book about the ideologies that are being replaced by conspiracy theories, which also, it's not about facts, it doesn't matter the facts, it's about writing some fairy tale which says who is guilty and where to find an enemy in order to have some collective hunt, I don't know.
First, I always was taking Schmitt very seriously. I do believe he's one of the most serious critics of liberalism and liberal democracy. And if you go particularly to his definition of the sovereign, the one who decides on the state of emergency, the exceptional situation, the emergence of the nuclear weapon is the biggest kind of illustration of his idea of sovereignty. This is not a decision that you're going to take by a parliamentary debate, to use a nuclear power or not. So from this point of view, Schmitt is a very, very strong figure, but don't forget, for Schmitt, friend-enemy relations was relations between states. This is not what we are seeing now. In the last 15, 20 years, what is defining the world is much more civil wars than the traditional wars between states. The level of polarization in some places is very high. Just to give you an idea, at this very moment, the number of the Republicans and Democrats, respectively, who said that they are not going to be pleased if their son or daughter is going to marry somebody from the other party, is as high as these relations between the Protestants and Catholics at the late 19th century. And here is one interesting empirical study. This is an American data. This is different, but just to understand how big, and because this, I'll go to the conspiracy theories. Several empirical studies, and there was an article which was recently basically summarizing this in the New York Times, showing the following. With the increase of education, people are becoming much more tolerant when it comes to ethnicity or religious. They're much more controlling for this type of biases. But they're becoming more intolerant when it comes to people who do not share their political ideas. And the explanation is not so difficult. Better educated people has invested much more to have their own political ideas. They know better why they stand for this or that, and this is why they are much more intolerant. Conspiracy theory is not a new phenomenon, but I do believe that we see a much more important move in which political identities are based on the conspiracy theories much more than ideologies. And here is one important distinction which I do believe in Eastern Europe are better going to understand than Western Europe. And here's the story. In a certain way, communism is also conspiracy theory, because Marxism is telling you the story, who is guilty and so on, but there is a normative dimension. There is a future dimension. There is a certain normative horizon in which you claim certain things. As a result of it, you can continue claiming being communist, honest communist, criticizing the communist government or the communist party from the position of this normative perspective. You cannot do this with conspiracy theory. For example, the strongest predicator of who is going to vote for Mr. Kaczynski party in Poland was not education, was not age, and it was not even basically in which part of the country you live. The strongest predicator was, do you believe that what happened in Smolensk was an accident or assassination? There is no normative dimension here. You either buy it or you don't buy it. And if you don't buy it, in a certain way, you don't have any influence over this community. There is a lot of psychological studies showing that people can change their opinion only if the criticism comes from somebody who belongs to their community. So this is why, for example, ex-communism was so important for the delegitimation of communism. Because it's one thing basically to be attacked from outside, it's totally difficult to be attacked from inside. But this attack and disagreement from inside is not possible when political identity is based on conspiracy theory. The moment you stop to buy the conspiracy theory, you're not part of the community anymore. And to be honest, this is true for the right, this is true for the left. In a certain way, if you see basically also how quickly people stop disagreeing on certain facts simply because the moment you start to do it, you're going to be excluded. And critical thinking is becoming very problematic in the conspiracy theory age. There is a great, by the way, British political scientist who just published a book, which I'm strongly recommending. This is going to be an interesting person to invite to discuss the reinvention and the rethinking of Europe, David Runciman. He's a Cambridge political scientist. He wrote a book which is called How Democracy Ends. It's not one of these the end of things. But he's basically trying to see how democracy ends, not looking back, are we back in 30s and so on, but one of the things was technology, the other was conspiracy theory, and also the interesting changing of the idea of the coup d'etat, what it means today. I'm saying this because this is a major different idea of how political identities are based. And this is why I don't believe that we simply can extrapolate from some previous experiences. And to give one more argument how the world is in a certain way changing in a big way. One of the major disadvantages of any type of authoritarianism historically was that authoritarian regimes never had an access to relevant information. In a certain way, you create a huge police machine, Soviet Union or Stasi, East Germany, but because this machine starts to have its own incentive, they start to distort the information. And you have it, and you basically listen to everybody, but at the end of the day, you don't understand anything. This is changing with the big data. In a big data, you're going to have authoritarianism in which you don't have police informers anymore, because we're informing on ourselves on a daily basis. Any moment you're going to buy something, you're talking to the phone and so on. And it's not about personally. You're not governing through understanding individual, but through understanding basically information flows. This is a type of authoritarianism that is a new phenomenon. And from this point of view, China is something that is really interesting and to be studied. From this point of view, when people are talking a lot about Russia and so on, Russia from this point of view is a very traditional place. China is not. And how it happened that if 5 or 10 years ago, new technology, social media, was very much perceived as empowering people, and then suddenly we start to recognize that probably disempowers. This is, in my view, the questions that are directly connected to the problem of liberal democracy, but also to the problem of Europe, because these new communities and identities we're talking about, they're online identities. I don't have a mobile phone. As a result of it, I'm not part of social media and so on. You cannot imagine the difference between me and my colleagues when you start discussing what is happening. And the difference is that they have a huge intensity, because before we're going to meet, they have read 50 tweets. And I don't know, even if somebody had been kind of criticizing me because I didn't know, I was not very much kind of overexcited. So from this point of view, you have a political life which is based not on consistency, which is typical for ideological age, but on intensity. This is when people are, for example, criticizing the populists, that they change their position every day, they're relevant to how the modern voter is facing and basically shaping his choices. He does not remember yesterday. There is no yesterday. There is only today, and the problem is how intensive you are.
Today we talked a lot about populism, and while reading your book, I found a really important question. While most observers ask how populism can be vanquished in any view, the more opposite question is how to respond to its banality. So how can we respond to that question which was raised in your book?
Okay, let's start with a joke, which is going to be the only thing that is going to remain with you out of my conversation, because it is a Swiss joke, and there are not many of them, but it's a methodological one. And the joke is the following. There were 3 boys, 8, 9-year-old, the German boy, the French boy, and the Swiss boy, and they discussed where the babies come from. And the German boy said, they're coming from the sky, and parents find them in front of the door, and the French boy started laughing. He said, this is ridiculous. Of course, they come from the bedroom. And then the Swiss boy became very nervous. And he said, do not generalize. It's different from canton to canton. Why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because populism is a problem. The way we talk about populism is a problem too. We try to come with a general explanation for very different phenomena. Obviously, there is a general trend which goes on, and you can come cultural issues versus economic issue. There was this famous Harvard study that was done. But in a certain way, if you want to respond to something, the response is always going to be local. For example, people are putting very easily, for example, Poland and Hungary, when they talk about the rise of populism of Central Europe. And there is many similarities when you basically see dismantling of the independent centers of power, be it judiciary, attack on the media. But you know, when it comes to corruption, they're totally different regimes. Hungarian regime is very corrupt, and in a certain way, corruption is part of the way the regime functions. Mr. Kaczynski is not a corrupt politician. You can like or dislike him, but it is not what is driving his policy. He's very ideological, he's very conservative, he's very reactionary, but he even didn't have a bank account till some years ago. So from this point of view, if you try to believe that this is absolutely the same phenomena, and you're trying to say, oh, this is like Trump, and this is like this, and this is like this, you cannot respond. So from this point of view, if you want to respond, the first thing that should happen is to try to understand the driving forces in this very concrete society and in these very concrete groups. Because there are similarities, but there are dissimilarities. We were talking about, for example, in Italy, for 10 years, the economy was not growing. And of course, the financial crisis hurt Italians. And of course, you have a lot of youth unemployment. And if you're a young academic in Italy, the only way to become a professor is that your professor should die. And the professors are living longer and longer. And then basically, you have a huge amount of real migrants. I mean, you have refugees. You see them on the street, even more. Some of these people, because they cannot work, you see them on the street all the time because they're even not working, so basically here and there. So when you talk about this, is one story. And when basically you have the same phenomena based on the same anti-immigration rhetoric and others happening in a different country, it's different. And I do believe that this is my first story. Basically, don't try to come with a general explanation and with a general response. It's never going to work. Secondly, I do believe that one of the two major mistakes that are made in analyzing the phenomena is because the modern world is preoccupied with the economy. So everybody is trying to come with the economic explanation, and I have been listening to many people said basically Mr. Orban is going to be destroyed because he did this or that. Listen, his economic policy after 2010 crisis is not as irrational as it looks. He decided to save the Hungarian middle class that have borrowed in Swiss francs, basically the foreign collapse. If they have been basically on the market level, were trying to pay this money that they have borrowed, 1 million of the Hungarian middle class was going to be done. But as a result of this, he made two assumptions. One of them was important, and he was right. The other pushed him into the direction which I don't know to what extent he was expecting to go. So in 2010, he decided that foreign investors are not going to leave the country, nevertheless that he's putting additional taxes and so on, because they made so much money in the previous period that they understand that they should pay a higher price for this. And he was right. None of the major investors left Hungary. Nevertheless, that particularly on the banking sector and the retail sector, he put a special taxes that were very much targeting the foreign investors. But because of the fear that if he goes back to the IMF for money, he's going to be punished for this changed his foreign policy. He turned to the Russians and the Chinese as an alternative source of funding because he was afraid to go there. So this is why, in a certain way, in my view, it's very important to see how it worked in this concrete context with these concrete people. And the certain thing that for me is very important is, no, it's not that the economy is going to destroy these regimes. Cultural and identity issues are more important for them. They're not so much meddling with the economy like the populists in Latin America in the 1950s. And the third thing which is important is that liberals in Europe these days are becoming totally pro-status quo. You start, because all these populists are attacking the European Union or liberal democracy, you try to defend, and many times you defend even things that you don't like yourself. You believe that they should change. This is a very weak position. And if there was important part of the Macron effect in France, the strength of Macron was that he managed to marry the idea of change and the idea of Europe. I do believe from this point of view the response to populism is not to create anti-populist fronts and say we're here to defend this and that, but to come with a different idea of change, and this change which is liberal and pro-European, and not basically said, no, everything that happened is great and basically nothing better can happen, because even if it was good, people are taking it for granted. And just telling people you're going to lose this and this and this, it's not so easy. People don't believe that they can lose certain things. United Kingdom, from this point of view, was a great example that you cannot easily scare people because people believe that it's going to stay anymore. But they need a positive change. They need a Europe, but a different Europe. And of course, different people imagine different Europes. But I do believe that being a party of change is always better in politics, like in intellectual life, than simply being kind of a defender.
Thank you. I still have enough questions for our conversation to last until late midnight, but I know that I'm not the only one to ask here, so I turn my head to you, and the floor is yours, and I will bring you the microphone. So.
Thank you very much, sir, for coming here and sharing your knowledge. I wanted to take your attention to migration crisis. My dad is a journalist, and he has been working in the Middle East for a really long time. And I've been volunteering in the UNHCR. And there's one big problem that I saw, and I made a little comparison, and I want your perspective on this. In the Middle East, we see that the majority of the refugees are going to already improving countries, but not to Europe, excluding Germany. There has been discussions that if refugees are really integrated really well to the country, it can help the country's economy. What is the problem with Europe, in your perspective, that the refugees are not really totally integrated? For example, in Lithuania, I went to Caritas, and they told me that most of the refugees are leaving the country. And the main reason was disintegration. So in your perspective, what is the reason behind this? If I'm clear enough.
No, you're very clear. Let's try to answer. And first, if we're talking about numbers, the refugee migration wave of 2015 is not as impressive as if you're going to believe if you're reading the news. There are more refugees in Turkey than in the whole of European Union. So obviously we're not talking simply about numbers. We're talking about other things. And here is what makes it, here one of the reasons is what I started with, ethnic homogeneity. You're coming, listen, when you go to London and migrate, you're basically, there is a hosting community of your own people which is helping you basically to integrate and so on. And this is one of the major driving forces when you see where people emigrate, particularly people from very poor countries. The major places that they decide to migrate to is where there is diaspora. And this is Collier and others, this is a well-documented, story. By the way, there is also things which defined the waves of migration, which was a major surprise for me. One of the biggest migrant destinations for Bulgarians turned to be Spain. This is not an obvious destination, particularly if you keep in mind that it continued even during the financial crisis, where there was a very high levels of unemployment, and the construction sector that was basically getting most of these people. Why? It appeared that climate and culture are very important when it comes to the immigration, to refugees and others. Secondly, for Central, you go to bigger places. One of the major mistakes being made in all of the countries is when they started to send refugees to the rural areas. In order to be integrated, you need these bigger urban spaces in which you're going to find place for yourself. And from time to time, there was a scene on the Bulgarian television that was, for me, kind of really heartbreaking on both sides, because there was a Syrian family who was sent to a Bulgarian village, and you have all the villagers protesting. And listen, this is amazing. So the Syrian family was father, mother, and 4 kids. The village was 82 persons, and there was no kid being born in this village in the last 15 years. So theoretically, you believe this is a good idea. But it's only theoretically. Because basically there is nobody for the kids, and there is nobody for the, in a certain way you start to feel, and both sides, and one of this old Bulgarian lady who said, listen, I want to die in the world that I know. It's not to live. It's not about I want to live in the world that I know. I want to die in the world that I know. I'm saying this because the problem with immigration, 4 things has changed. And in the book I'm making an argument which is the following. Immigration is the new revolution of the 21st century. And this is very radical because it is based on the world which is interconnected, which is totally unequal, where people know very well how the other part of the world is living. So the frame of comparison has totally changed. And many people realize that if you want to change your life in 1 generation, better change the country than try to change the government. This is rational. We East Europeans have been doing it ourselves, so there is no reason to be surprised that other people are doing this. But then comes the story of when this is happening, the question is, are people coming from the culture that you know or not? Poland, who is extremely negative to any type of refugees running from the wars, coming from Syria, at the same time they have almost 2 million now Ukrainians working as a labor migrant. Not much a big problem for anybody. So how to do and how to deal and integrate people with a different cultural perspective is particularly important if you have made as part of your own political culture that you're going to respect the cultures of others, which means that you cannot go to a classical assimilation from a previous periods. The human rights standards, that one of the best things that has happened is making integration not easier. And thirdly, which is going to be a surprise for you, the richer the country is, the more welfare you have. And paradoxically, it's much more difficult to integrate, because I was trying to compare how these same Syrians are integrated in Turkey and how they integrated in Germany. In Turkey, who integrates people is the market and the families. The state is not very much present. There is around 3 million, basically, people being around in Turkey. Out of them, only 400,000 are in kind of refugee camps and others. Others, you're going to see them through kind of a black markets and so on, but they're part of the everyday life. If you go to Germany, basically because it's a well-functioning welfare state, you should be taken, there should be administration, you should have this and that, there is much more bureaucracy. So paradoxically, some states with a weaker bureaucracies are better integrating outsiders than a very well-functioning and regulating states. One of the reasons in Central and Eastern Europe, I should be also very much honest on this, that makes so difficult to not simply to integrate, but to show any sympathy, because there is a moral problem on our side, which is not simply that you are not integrating people, but you're even not ready to recognize them as the victims. We start to basically compete with these people who is the real victim, is the failure to integrate the Roma community. We didn't manage for so many years to integrate people that have been living with us forever. The number of the dropouts of school, for example, in Bulgarian educational system, and you have here education minister being, is incredible. And I have been hearing people telling me, okay, we didn't integrate the Roma, why you believe that we have any capacity to integrate basically people coming from the Middle East? In Germany, it's not like this. People can basically, in Germany, there are many people who are going to say, it's not that we cannot integrate them, but we don't believe this is the right thing to do. But they believe in the capacity of their state. In Eastern Europe, many people do not believe in the capacity of our state to integrate. So all this goes there. And the third element, which is going to be surprising for you, is the major difference, two major differences between East and West when it comes to integration is none of the East European countries has a colonial history. None of East European country has a colonial history. No sense of guilt, and also no encounter. We don't believe that we own anything to these people. We have not been there, which is not, to be honest, factually true. Socialist countries have been meddling quite a lot in some of this. But this is a very important story. You don't have the feeling that you have been there. You don't have a history as these people, which was not the case in some of the West European countries. And plus, a very different meaning of 1968. 1968 is a very important in this story with. 1968 was the moment when Western Europe discovered decolonization as a very important element, and there was identity with people who are not like us. The idea of rights was rights with minorities, people who are not like us. In Central and Eastern Europe, 1968 was about the sovereignty of the state. The Czechs, the Poles, it was very much kind of anti-Soviet, but it was about national identity. It was about our national sovereignty against the imperial power. While the West identified themselves as the imperialists, we have been identifying as the victims of imperialism. So from this point of view, I'm giving all this cultural explanation not to justify. Listen, I can understand if Bulgarian government says we cannot integrate 100,000 people. I do believe it is true, and I have a sympathy for this. What I don't have a sympathy for is this hostile language. It's one thing not to be able to help people. It's totally different, right, to criminalize people in order to explain why you cannot do something for them. And this is a very different issue. And this is happening on the level of society, much more than even on the level of the government. Also, this is interesting to see how geography matters. Listen, anti-refugee sentiment is probably equally strong in Hungary and Bulgarian. Bulgarian government never said things that the Hungarian government said. Not because Bulgarian government is necessarily more liberal, but because we have a Turkish minority of 10%, we are with the border of Turkey, so you cannot afford this. I have been reading some studies about the language of the senior criminals in the Russian prison, Vori v Zakonye. It appeared that it's a very polite people when they talk to each other. Because the words has consequences. If you're going to swear him, he should kill you. And you know it, because everything is about respect. So from this point of view, when people are talking about fear, in Europe we are not fearful, we are anxious. Fearful people do not talk the bullshit that you can hear in most of the European discussions. If you really fear somebody, you are very careful with words. While one of the things that we see in Europe these days is people are very uncareful with words. And from this point of view, I don't know to what extent this gives you an explanation why, but people go where they're going to find a place for themselves. And the smaller place, the more ethnically homogeneous place, they don't find a place for themselves, even when economic opportunities probably are better.
Well, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. I actually would like to ask you and to contemplate a bit on the other boundary between Western and Central and Eastern European countries, which I think is very important. And so far I did not hear you mentioning that word is religion and the role of religion in the societies, comparing Western European societies and Central and Eastern European societies, where religion, particularly the national churches, have a very strong word in societies and their lives, and also relating to the attitudes towards migration. Religion also has a very important saying. So what would be your idea? How can religion be placed in all these debates about Europe and what is going to be after Europe?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great question. First, I'm going to refer those of you who are interested in this in a recent study that was done by the Pew Research, which was a survey of religious attitudes all over Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, Central Europe plus the post-Soviet space without the Central Asian republics. And this was a comparison, the same study had been done in 1991. Because answering you, I'm going to come with the most favorite statement of any political scientist. It's more complex than it looks. First, I'm not a great specialist on religion. Isaiah Berlin used to say that in the way some people do not have ear for music, he does not have an ear for God. I'm probably on this side. And this is very much also based on the fact that, unlike some other East European countries, in Bulgaria, religion was not a particularly strong factor. But there's three things that you're going to be interested in answering your question. When it comes to the refugees, the strongest anti-refugee sentiments is in the most secular country in Europe, and this is the Czech Republic. 70% of the Czechs identified themselves as secular. Where comes the difference between East and West is that in Germany, the churchgoers, the Catholics, active Catholic believers, are twice less likely to vote for alternative for Germany than the average German. Basically, the Catholic believers are not going this way. In Poland, the active churchgoers are much more likely to vote for peace than the secular people. what I see is the interesting development, particularly, and now I'm talking much more for the Catholic Church, because in the Orthodox Church, and there are people, Max knows much more about me, but normally in our countries, religious identity was very much national identity. This was historically, and this is also part of one of the differences of the Orthodox Church, where basically the Tsar is above the Patriarch. You can start to find this in some of the countries like Poland, where basically Polish continues to be a Catholic country, but their Catholicism is becoming much more national. The universal dimension of this is starting to disappear. And this is connected to a very important fact. When you ask yourselves why Pope Francis, being the biggest advocate for support of refugees and others, is doing there, and why some of the Catholic churches in Eastern Europe are not there, keep in mind one empirical fact. Only 1/3 of the Catholics in the world are living in Europe today. Catholicism is not a European religion anymore. So when he thinks about refugees, he's thinking about all these Catholics from Latin America who are trying to cross in the United States. While the Catholic churches in Europe, I mean particularly Eastern Europe, because this is not the position particularly of the German Catholic Church, which was the strongest supporter for Chancellor Merkel when it comes to the refugees. But I'm saying this because one of the interesting stories that is happening in Europe, and I find this in a certain way worrying, is the following. The idea of Europe was based on two different types of universalisms coming from left and right in the post-war period. One was the universalism of the Catholic Church. It's not by accident that the Christian democratic parties and their leaders have been the founders of Europe. The other was coming from a kind of the Marxist tradition of the social democratic parties in Western Europe, which was kind of a post-national, proletariats from all over the world, the working class solidarity, more important than the national solidarity. Both of these universalisms are now in crisis. Catholic churches, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, becoming much more national churches than universalist church. And if you see how the working class vote migrate, this is the biggest migration in Europe. All of them migrated from left and center left to the far right. And I do believe this is something important to be discussed. How globalization paradoxically weakened universalism and basically cosmopolitan identities. Is it by accident that the most cosmopolitan person that we know, Kant, was famous for not leaving his town? To what extent that the fact that people know each other much more makes it much more difficult for them to imagine the universal world to which we all belonged. So this is it. Of course, there are differences between the churches. Churches are also very much imitating each other. For example, Bulgarian church very much changed its political role for the last 2 or 3 years. Some of the states are using the churches also as a source of influence. This is also true, but for me, this is more important. The universalist message coming particularly from the Catholic Church cannot be seen in some of these countries. On the other side, and this is the last because it's factual, you know that recently the Bavarian government suggested that there should be crosses being put in front of all public buildings in order to keep the cultural identity of the state. The first person to protest was Bishop Marx. Of course, he's always joking with his name, but this is the seniorest German bishop. He was the head of the European conferences of the bishops, who basically said, don't do this. Don't provoke people. Because for the church, the major divide is between believers and non-believers. And this is an interesting, the Pope believes that he can find much easier an alliance with other religions but people who believed than with the seculars in certain ways, which is not the case, for example, for populist leaders in which religion is not the relations with God, but much more about national and ethnic identities. I didn't expect to talk about God in Vilnius. And the truth is that God never talked to me.
So you just answered a question about God. Now I'm going to ask you about poetry.
Okay.
I was really interested about your emphasis which you make in your book and which you repeated right now about this anxiety connected to the loss of tradition, especially the literary tradition, the poetical tradition. I find this argument quite unexpected in a book of a political scientist, and my first question was to ask, how did you come to this argument? Why this state of national literary tradition seemed so important to you? You just call it a metaphysical anxiety. And the second thing is that you just told that this kind of anxiety cannot be dealt with in economic terms. Yeah. So the question is, in which terms it should be dealt with? What should be the positive reply?
Thank you very much. On the first question, why this in the book of the political scientist, the answer is very easy. Probably I'm not a very good political scientist. And this is one of the interesting things that happened with the political science. Political science, very much like all social sciences, is trying to be perceived as a very rigorous science. So the language that we start to use is very much mathematical language. And if you basically, particularly, if you go on the American political science, you're going to see very much of this. With the big data, by the way, the social sciences are going to be transformed in the way that I don't believe we're prepared for this, because normally social science works, you have hypotheses, and then you are trying to test this hypothesis on a certain type of a sample, and then you try to see is your explanation working or not. Imagine that big data, which works on patterns, we are going to become much better to predict, but we are going to be unable to explain why. The question why is going to disappear. We are going to be better to say what is likely or less likely to happen in political life. I do believe we're going to be more precise when it goes even to electoral behaviors and others, but we're going to lose the narrative. Political science was unable basically to tell a story, and I do believe as a result of it, political science is going to lose influence, not to gain influence, but it's a different story. I used to write poetry when I was young. I have a book of poetry. But also I do believe cultural references is one of the things that make the nation nation. In a certain way, nation is probably a group of people which can respond to a certain cultural references. You basically assume that when you're going to use this reference, this group is going to understand what you mean. Because it was part of the national canon, because it was part of a certain experience, because this is how basically you have been socialized. And one of the difficult problems with, for example, the younger generations, particularly if you are basically trying to teach in a different national context, is that there's three things that you basically very difficultly do these days. First of all, jokes. Because, for example, most of this, for example, particularly all of us are full of the Soviet time jokes. The only place that you can use it is basically on the retired professors meeting. People don't understand. Plus, you have, of course, the political correctness story. And this is also very interesting. And it is interesting not because it's a different sensitivities. This is becoming a major problem for generation. East Europeans, we have a very, particularly in the Balkans, we have a very specific sense of humor, which has some of its particularities. But I always believe that this is explanatory and it helps, and when it is got, and you start to understand that for the younger generation, first, they don't get it, but secondly, they don't like it, to be honest. It's simply different senses. I'm not blaming them. They could be even right. I was trying yesterday to make in a public talk an argument. It was about President Trump, and I said, listen, you should understand that he does not have the term ally in his understanding of politics. They're friends, enemies, but ally has a reciprocal relations. This is not about him. It's not that he's right or wrong, but it's a different view. And I said, he treats the allies like ex-wives, which means moral and financial claims and no much fun. And then a very young and nice person came to me and he said, listen, good argument, bad joke. And this gap between generations is also becoming quite interesting. And this is because I know that the next question is coming from Max Trudeau. This is one thing that makes a very strong impression on me. I was very much interested to the level of political mobilization in all of our societies concerning particularly gay marriages. In Bulgaria, Istanbul Convention was a big issue, and so on and so on. And when it came to Russia, Russia is not famous for conservative sexual life, let's put it like this. And never have been. The level of abortions, this is not what they're famous for. And then I was trying to understand why such a very strong public reaction to this. And I was talking to one of the Russian legislators who was very active in promoting this. And it appeared that her son is a gay boy who had been studying abroad. And she said a sentence that opened my mind. She said, "And you have stolen and corrupted our kids." So part of this social issue comes with the fact that suddenly you discover that your relations with your kids, with the next generation, becoming highly problematic. Particularly those people who went to study abroad, and this was very typical for the Russian elite. Most of their kids studied abroad. They're coming back. Their differences are not political. It's not about President Putin, but it's about social life, what is good, what is bad, and so on. And the fact that somebody has stolen your kids because you cannot talk to them anymore, this is why I do believe we're going to see in the next years very strong backlash against universities. Not Western University, not Soros University, not about concrete university. But one of the interesting things in the way you have this very strong Republican clash against the church at the end of the 19th century, I do believe the universities are perceiving basically as this major transformation of culture and so on that society starts not to accept, feel threatened by it, and so on. And this is going to be an interesting phenomenon, particularly keeping in mind that the number of people who are getting education is going very much up, university education, and also that for the first time, even in the United States, it starts to have a very strong gender dimensions. For the first time, the women in this generation are getting more university education than men, which is also a major shift of power to be. So this is where I go with cultural references and poetry.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I was thinking about this. Over the heads of those meritocratic elites you were talking about in the States, both, and in Europe, over their heads, I think we're going to have this meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump soon, probably. And however hard they tried to prevent it. What do you think about the meeting itself? Do you think it would be more, show business than substance, as was that summit a couple of weeks ago in Singapore? Or it will be something more important? And how would you compare the threats or attitudes towards the European project that are concentrated in the Kremlin in Moscow and in the current White House, the current administration? Which threats, which apparently negative attitudes to the European project, which is more important and probably more dangerous?
Thank you for the question. On this, probably I'm in a minority group of one, but here is where I stand. And I have been, as Max knows, I have been trying very much to study this. One of the major questions is why all populist parties openly display their support and admiration for President Putin, and most of the people are going to give the explanation, either Russian money or basically Russian intelligence. There is part of it, I'm not buying this 100%. What is the most important for the populist party is to show that they are not part of the establishment. And if there was one central point in the elite consensus on foreign policy, this is rejection of President Putin. So if you want to show how different you are, you should be for Putin. Secondly, what is very important, Russians meddled in the American elections, and this is basically well documented. Did Russians wanted to elect Trump? I'm not sure. I do believe that for them was much more important to show that they're great power. And for them, the definition of the great power is, I'm going to do to you what you believe that you're doing to me. This is extremely important, this type of reciprocity, which in my view is totally kind of even deprived of meaning. You're doing this because you want to show capacity to do it. I'm doing it to show is that I can do it. I don't believe that the Russians expected Trump to win, for a very simple reason. Russians had a very overvalued, used to have a very overvalued judgment on the power of the Western elites and establishment. They were perceiving the Western elites as much stronger than they were, in the way we perceive Kremlin as much stronger than it is. But then comes something that really brings President Trump and President Putin together on something which is very essential. What is, in my view, the most interesting about President Trump? And the problem with Trump is that he's not the most perfect individual that we have seen. So as a result of it, people are so much focused on his tweets, on his behavior, that nobody is ready to see more consistency than, in my view, it is. He does not have ideology, but he has an instinct. And there's 3 or 4 basic assumptions to which he subscribes and who are real. They are not changing. The first of them is the following. The world that America built after 1989 is not in the interest of the United States. America built a world in which the biggest beneficiaries are Europe to some extent and also China. So in a certain way, if America tries to increase its influence in the world, unlike all previous presidents that believe that America should be the one providing stability in the world, in his view, America should become the disruptor in chief. Because in the situation of chaos, America being the most powerful nation on earth, it's going to be always in a better relations in the bilateral with everybody else, including the Chinese. Secondly, what he believes is that President Bush was right to go on the regime change, but he was going on a little wrong regimes to change. Because what should be changed is not authoritarian regimes, but the trade regimes. So while for Bush, divide was democracy, autocracy, for Trump, divide is a surplus versus deficit when it comes to the relations with the US. And from this point of view comes to your answer. I don't believe that President Trump wants to break European Union. This is not an intention. I don't believe this is a strategy. But he believes that Germany should change its trade policy and basically totally change the relations with the US, because also he believes that Germany has benefited too much out of this world than they deserve. But in order to do it, European Union can break down, because you cannot basically change the trade relations with Germany without basically breaking the European Union. So the difference between Putin and Trump is that while President Putin probably has a much more clear intention that he does not like European Union in the way it is, his capacity to do it are much more limited. While President Trump, I don't believe that he has particularly intention to break the European Union, but he has a very concrete goals to perceive, and this unintendedly can end up with breaking the European Union, because he is the first American president who does not see European Union as a major objective of American foreign policy. So this is not a conspiracy theory. It's not that he wants this, but he wants different trade relations with Germany. Germany is saying, well, we cannot negotiate with you because we are part of the European Union. He said, okay, I'm going, if it is not on the level of the European Union, then I'm going to put you to negotiate with me. Then comes also one last aspect of your question. Like everybody who believes that politics is a zero-sum game, and I do believe President Trump believes it, your enemy is much more interesting than your ally. Because as I said, ally is somebody who basically all the time insists on reciprocity. And the ally is always a constraint. I'm just going to give a painful example on the case of Baltics. If you believe that you want to disrupt the world order for the benefit of your country, you should have a certain level of unpredictability. What your allies want from you is a very strong predictability. So President Trump believes that America is going to benefit more if nobody knows, is America going to defend Baltics or not in the case of crisis. Not because he's not ready to defend it, but because he believes that uncertainty is strengthening his position. But from the position of the allies, this uncertainty is just scary. And this is why the relations are so difficult, and this is why it's less personal than it looks, because this is a changing role. When you're a disruptor, you don't need allies. You need allies when you're a stabilizer in chief. But it's a different view of the American role in the world. And to be honest, of course, he's touching on 2 or 3 things that are real. Probably America does not have the resources to play the role it played 10 or 20 years ago. If you go back to President Obama was sharing the view that America does not have resources to underwrite the world, but his idea was that they're going to kind of sell shares to other countries, and interestingly enough, Russia was the first one that shares were offered. And here comes the interesting story, and this is, I was just reviewing the memoirs of Mike McFaul, who was American ambassador in the United States, and it's very interesting from this point of view. And you can easily see that post-Cold War order was born with the successful East European revolutions, and it ended with the failure of the Arab Spring. It's a very clear story that it was basically during the Arab Spring where major relations changed, including the relations with Russia. And the most interesting is we always talk about Ukraine, but Ukraine came later. It was Mubarak, it was Libya, where basically was the major decision of the Russian government is it does not make sense to be in a good relations with the Americans. You cannot rely on you. They're never going to defend you if you have an internal problem. And this is what all these people were looking for. So from this point of view, I don't know what is going to come out of these meetings, because these meetings are very much a kind of symbolic events. But even if there's going to be any type of a concrete agreement, it's going to increase the uncertainty and not to decrease it. Sorry.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Italian, and I would like to ask, because you mentioned about Italy, if Italy can be considered a laboratory on new political era, and because there is in a big country of Europe, there is identitarian populistic government which is showing different ways to act in policy. And then is another question, is joined to the first one, the impact of social media to break down the regime disinformation, I would call it. And if this can be associated with Christopher Lasch called the rebellion of the elite. So the elite, the intellectuals elite, are not anymore online with people thoughts, people belief. And the third question is that nowadays we are entering in the new era. So it's not anymore, we saw fascism, we saw communism, we saw liberalism, and probably is the time to overcome liberalism and in the post-liberal era. So it's time to see globalization and multiculturalization, let's see mondialism in another way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Listen, on Italy, I'm sure that you know more than me. But I'm going to make just one argument, because Italy is very interesting. On one level, it is representative, on the other, it's not. Because economic performance of Italy is really dismal. And it's not about financial crisis only. For many reasons, Italian economy have been underperforming for a very long period of time. So from this point of view, Italy is in a slightly different position than most of the other European economies. But what is very interesting about Italy is that you have two types of a kind of populist mobilization, and I'm not using populism in as negative terms as many people. So here is the story. There was a populism born by the financial crisis, which came much more from the left. You have Syriza, you have Podemos, and it was very much about attack on the financial system. And you have basically the one being born by the migration crisis. What is interesting about these two types of a populism is that they had a different logic. The first one was very much based on the idea of a network activism, and this is five-star movement ended up as very different than any other parties, because as you know, this is a kind of a crowdsourcing of decision-making. In order to be supporter of the five-star, you go, you have your password, you go on the platform, you vote on certain decisions, and basically your representatives in the parliament are just a technical figures obliged to vote what the majority of the party members want. It never works like this. It didn't work like this also in Italy, but this was a radical experiment with different type of politics. And then you have a classical anti-immigration politics organized around the figure of the leader, Salvini. Okay, here is my kind of a not very optimistic prognosis. When you have two populisms clashing, the anti-immigration one is going to prevail over the anti-financial, because on the migration politics, it's much easier to come with the symbolic changes that look as a change than what you can achieve on the economic sphere. So for five-star movement, you have the basic income that they promise. It's going to be much more difficult than for Salvini to stop the ships coming.
But so far he stopped.
Exactly. No, it's much easier. No, from this point of view, he did it. Well, they cannot do it. And from this point of view, one populism is much better positioned for short-term games than the other. And this is when you have the competition of this populism, the anti-migrant one is going to prevail politically. I'm not talking about neither the normative part of it, not on the long-term perspective. So this is one of my major arguments in the book to claim that paradoxically, nevertheless, that you have real migrants in a very few countries. Migration crisis is the only pan-European crisis, because the Euro crisis was a crisis of the Eurozone. Countries out of the Eurozone were not part of it. Russia-Ukrainian crisis, big issue for countries like Poland or the Baltic republics, non-issue for Spain or Italy. But even in the countries in which you don't have a single migrant, migration crisis became a major political issue and transformed politics, because it basically pushed the migration of voters to the far right based on this anxiety and fears that we're talking about. So you're talking about what is going to be after liberalism and so on. There's going to be something, but the problem is that liberalism also was never been what it is now. I mean, all of these things are changing all the time. And in my view, the much more important for our conversation is to what extent the things like the personal, individual freedoms, rights of people, and so on are going to be preserved. Because they have been, when I was making this reference to the Chinese big data authoritarianism, this is a governing which is not based on the existence of the individual. You're not repressing him. You're simply ignoring its existence. And here, of course, the social media comes as a very interesting factor. If in China you decide to write a critical block to the performance of the local Communist Party, you are not going to be sanctioned. Even more, this information is going to be processed, and under certain conditions, they can act on it. But if you suggest to your friends, because you're outraged of this failure, to go on the street, what is going to happen to you is that your block message is not going to reach anybody. Because any type, what they're sanctioning is a collective action. Simply because they react on a keywords, and it's a very sophisticated system. It's not simply that you're going to have a problem, and you're going to have a problem, but the problem is you're going to have the feeling that you have sent it, and other people have read it, and they have not. And I do believe this is a different understanding of democracy, authoritarianism, capitalism, freedom, and this is why probably we should start our conversation based on a much more simple questions answering. How people can ensure their freedom of choice in a world of this, how they can ensure that their collective decision matter in a world like this, how they can ensure that they can change a government if they don't like it in the world like this. So many things are going to be open for questions. And if I have my own criticism towards part of the debate is that we are very much afraid to open the box. And this can become the biggest problem for the European Union also as a global player. There is no more miserable position than trying to defend the status quo that does not exist anymore. Yeah.
Well, I haven't read your book, and most probably I'm not going to read it, because my taste is in between New York and the Silicon Valley, as you said, sort of a little bit varied. The thing is, you are a very good and very interesting speaker, that's a fact, and thank you very much for that. When I found the invitation to come and I read the subject of the discussion, I felt a little bit intrigued, and I shall tell you why. My age allows to understand very well, I understood and I do understand very well now what it meant and what it means to be after the Soviet Union. So the intrigue is, we spoke about different global problems, European problems. What do you mean by after Europe? Well, for example, imagine I've been doing something for a very long time, and then I say, I'm bored, I'm tired, I quit, and I say, after me the deluge. Is there a possibility to say, after Europe, the deluge?
Thank you very much. This is a good, my answer is going to be less interesting than you expect. Authors are never the authors of their titles. And in a certain way, the book was read as a very kind of a radically pessimistic book. In fact, it is not. I'm first going to give one national defense and then trying to tell you what I mean after Europe. There was a study being done trying to compare the relations between the economic performance of societies and their state of optimism. And it appeared that the Bulgarians are the most pessimistic. We're total outliers. In The Economist, the title was The Optimists, the Pessimists, and the Bulgarians. Just to give you an example, in the United States, it was done 4 years ago. When you ask people, are you doing better than others, like others, worse than others, basically society should divide on three. People who are better than me on statistics are going to explain you how it works. In the United States, 32% of the people believe that they're better than they are. In Bulgaria, 24% believe that they're worse than they are. So, but saying this, the title of the book that I suggested, it was a stupid title, so this is why it was called Perhapsburg. And the Perhapsburg was that I do believe that first, history is open. After Europe means that European Union in the way we know today is not going to be the European Union of tomorrow. First of all, personally, I'm of the generation which very much identify with the European Union. If something is going to go wrong for me, this is going to be a personal loss. But secondly, I do believe it's very important to try to imagine that they're going to be something different. We still don't know how it's going to. By the way, we don't know the borders of this European Union. We don't know the political natures of this European Union. But this is the discussion. And secondly, the last part of the book is making one message which for me was optimistic, while basically people didn't read it probably like this. I said, listen, ever since the French Revolution, everybody had a good reasons to explain why the Habsburg Empire should collapse. But they didn't collapse for 100 years, and even more. Many historians claim that if it was not for the war and the defeat in the war, they can even have been survived longer. So from this point of view, this is why I'm quoting Rilke in the book, who speaks for victory. To endure is all. The very survival of any political project is the major source of legitimacy. Why we take the nation states for granted? By the way, do you know how small part of our historical time the nation state is there? Particularly in our part of the world, we have a nation state for just a small period of time. But we take it for natural form of human organization because it has demonstrated its capacity to survive major political crises. I do believe that the survival of the European Union is going to be the major source of legitimacy and not the realization of one or the other project of the EU. So from this point of view, this is where kind of my optimism comes from. After Europe means also that Europe as a political continent and we as Europeans, we also as a European culture, are going to see, of course, decline of our influence in the world. This is fact. This is fact because some of our ideas succeeded. Paradoxically, this was the fact that others adopted some of the Western ideas and so on that make the non-Western world more successful economically, politically. Demographically, of course, Eastern Europe is very much shrinking. This is a reality. Should we mourn about this? Personally, no. I don't feel like this. But we should recognize that the world is not what it used to be. And this is why, for me, the idea of the change, that instead of trying to be paralyzed by the idea that the world is changing, and because of this populism of fear, which I do believe also President Trump represents, you're not going to return America power from the 1950s. Never American GDP in the world is going to be in the same relations to the GDP of others like it was after the World War II. But it does not mean that you cannot have a meaningful place in the world to do things that makes people happy and also something that makes life dignified. So for me, this is the story of after Europe. So it's first, don't stick to the status quo and try to imagine that world that is different, but also the world in which there is place for you.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but if you don't mind, we still have an opportunity to discuss one very last question.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a fascinating discussion, I think, for all of us. Thanks so much for coming to Vilnius. Going back to this question on backlash against globalization and liberalism, I think it is quite paradoxical that the two countries that got first in this spiral are the two that have created the modern globalization as we know it, in terms of liberal democracy, freedom of speech, in terms of course, free markets, and cultural globalization through English language and literature, United Kingdom and United States, through Brexit referendum and election of Donald Trump. We've seen in both cases, indeed, the backlash against the system that both countries have so much contributed to. And you've mentioned very, very correctly that the European Union, or response of Europe, is very defensive, trying indeed to defend the system that is today, not only the European system, but the global system, defending the World Trade Organization, defending the Bretton Woods, defending the Paris Climate Change Agreement, defending the Iran nuclear deal, defending the free trade agreements that we have signed and we are ratifying at the moment. And it is very defensive in many ways, trying to make sure that it all survives. But you've said very provocatively and very interestingly that the best, perhaps better answer to populism is not to defend, but to be, in fact, proactive with an alternative solution or with an agenda of change, like was the case with President Macron in France. So would that then indeed a better answer of Europe would be to come up with a reinvented world order and try to convince President Trump to subscribe to it and to make sure that he's a part of it as a co-author? Or is it still better for us to try to cling to that world order without which we currently cannot see ourselves? Tonight, as we speak here, at the same moment, the European leaders are dining, just as we speak at this moment, and discussing the same issues: migration, Russia, Trump, and of course the future of Europe. If you were there at the moment, what would you tell them?
To be absolutely honest, I don't believe that they wait for me at the moment, because they should talk to each other. But you're making a very important question, just on the trade issue, to give you an example. And this is not something, it was suggested by many people. When the President Trump said that he wants basically to increase the tariffs on some European goods, and when it comes after that to the auto industry and others, one of the ideas what we did basically reciprocally to go and basically go after some of their goods, and particularly to go to the regions which are politically sensitive for the elections. The other opportunity is going to the Americans and said, okay, let's go on the zero tariffs when it comes to the cars. If your cars are so good, welcome. But you should open your market to the German cars with zero tariffs on both sides. And in my view, this is something that Europe is lacking, I mean, politically on unpredictability, because in order to defend the world order, we basically said there were three assumptions on which we go. One is, by the way, very popular among the liberal internationalists when it comes to the international relations, who said, listen, the institutional infrastructure that we have created is resilient. It can even survive in the absence of a liberal leader. For example, John Eikenberry is going to make this argument very strongly. To be honest, I'm not very much sure in this. For example, in Germany, after the elections, there was this idea, okay, let's try to get China, who is also very much beneficiary from the current world order, and use them as a partner for basically trying to protect certain type of a globalization that we do believe is also beneficial for us. And it sounds well on paper, but then you start to realize the following things. As a result of it, you also see a very strong infiltration of the Chinese companies in the technology sector of Germany. You basically, in order to keep them part of this defense coalition, should not criticize the unfair trade practices, but they are not beneficial to you in the long term. So instead of becoming an ally, you can become a hostage. And of course, Europe does not have the power to change the world order of its own. And I do believe people made a very bad service to Chancellor Merkel, for whom I have a very high respect, trying to tell her you're going to be the new leader of the free world. She could not do it. She does not have the capacity to do it. Germany is not a military power, full stop. And from this point of view, to pretend that military power doesn't matter even in the trade relations is not true. Because when Poland is going to decide how to shape their relations with this and that, they're always going to keep in mind that you can have the American military presence, but basically Germany does not have capacity to defend you. So from this point of view, in my view, this is a very difficult conversation. And one of the things that European Union, in my view, should do is really to change its kind of a totally defensive position and try to say, okay, you all guys, I mean President Putin, Mr. Trump, wants the world to change. We also want the world to change. And we go in this direction because the interesting story is that the legitimacy of all these people comes that they play disruption, but none of them offered any alternative. Any alternative. For example, one of the major, problem in my view the Russian foreign policy has today is that part of the strengths of Russian foreign policy was a certain level of unpredictability. With Trump in the White House, Russia lost monopoly over unpredictability. If before everybody is waking up and saying what President Putin is going to do, now with Mr. Trump in the White House, nobody bothers to ask this question. And this is a different world. And from this point of view, in this world, for Europe to find its place is not easy. So from this point, to be honest, I don't buy this cheap criticism also to the political leaders. They should do this, to do exactly what? But at least they should not do shit, as Obama used to say. For example, this absolutely tiny, idiotic nationalism, which you're doing just to show to your domestic public that you can create a problem. And believing that creating a problem is a demonstration of the capacity to be a sovereign state. This I find as a highly problematic. And nevertheless, that there is a trend, there is a crisis. I also don't believe this is a one-way street. For example, imagine for the moment that on the European elections, the opposition in Poland is going to prevail, which is not to be excluded at all. If you go on the opinion poll ratings, President Tusk is doing better than Mr. Kaczynski. Then the story of Central Europe is going to be totally different because Poland is a country that matters. So if something is going to change in Poland, everybody is going to see a positive trends here and there. Tell a totally different story. And this is my understanding that particularly the economists, but also some of my colleagues in political science, became very structural of explaining where the world goes. Go to Macron. You can say this and that, but it was not the success of a particular type of ideology or particular type of an idea. This was a person. This person was also lucky like hell. Totally lucky, but luck matters in politics. Machiavelli used to know this. Everybody used to know it. We are trying basically to pretend that personality doesn't matter. In European politics, the idea was how you're selecting the president of the European Commission. The only quality that she or he, and this till now it's only he, should have is not being a strong political leader. But this type of a logic cannot work anymore. And in my view, this is where I'll go. I'll try to go with asymmetrical responses to the Americans, but also to the Russians. We should not be the one that everybody knows what we're going to do next, and we're being the only one that does not know what others will do.
Having in mind that our conversation is going to the end, I would like to read the last sentence from your book, After Europe. Survival is a little like writing a poem. Not even the poet knows how it's going to end before it does. So, as a historian, I can only agree with that statement. I have seen many times that big data and sophisticated theories simply can't explain everything. That is why we need, I strongly believe, that we need to leave some space for unexpected and for hope, that we will be prepared for that. And I also believe that such books as After Europe, which was written by you, are the best teachers how to prepare for the unknown and for the unrehearsed. Thank you very much for that.
No, thank you very much for your presence and for general words. Tolstoy has a great saying, at least this is how Shklovsky quotes him. He said, the marriage, the day when they get married, is not the end of the story. This is the beginning. So thank you very much.